Jung believed most people never risk this test, even once. They go their entire lives being loved for a character they built in early childhood, refined through every friendship and relationship since, and mistake the applause for that character as evidence that they themselves are loved. It's an understandable mistake. It's also, according to Jung, one of the quiet tragedies of an unexamined life. But here's where it gets more complicated and more honest. Because the persona isn't only something other people impose on you, you participate in building it, sometimes eagerly, because there's a certain safety in being predictable, a certain relief in never having to explain the messier, more contradictory parts of yourself. The persona isn't just a cage. Sometimes it's a hiding place you built and then locked from the inside. And the first sign that something is shifting inside you isn't usually confidence. It's discomfort, a growing, restless discomfort with performing a self that no longer fits the way it used to. This discomfort often shows up first in small, almost embarrassing ways. You find yourself exhausted after gatherings that used to energize you. You find yourself agreeing to things out of habit, then resenting the agreement almost immediately. You find yourself laughing at jokes that don't actually land, because the muscle memory of being agreeable moves faster than your honest reaction. None of this feels dramatic in the moment. It feels like fatigue, like something is simply off, and most people misdiagnose it as burnout or busyness or needing a vacation, when what it actually is, according to everything Jung wrote about the persona, is the early cost of a self that has been managed for too long without maintenance. The maintenance Jung is talking about isn't self-care in the way people usually mean it. It's closer to self-honesty, the deliberate, uncomfortable practice of noticing where the performance ends and the person begins. And it rarely arrives as a single revelation. It arrives in fragments, usually triggered by exhaustion, betrayal, or the specific kind of grief that comes from being replaced by someone who was simply willing to perform the same role you'd grown tired of playing. This is often how people first encounter their own shadow, not through therapy, not through deliberate reflection, but through jealousy. Watching someone else receive the affection you used to receive, for being agreeable. Watching someone else get praised for the same silence you once mistook for peace. And feeling something ugly rise up that you don't recognize and don't like. Jung would say, don't look away from that feeling. Look directly at it, because that ugly, uncomfortable reaction is the shadow finally surfacing, showing you exactly what you've been protecting yourself from seeing. Most people's first instinct is to suppress that reaction immediately, to feel ashamed of the jealousy, the resentment, the flicker of anger, and bury it back down before anyone, including themselves, notices it happened. But suppression was never actually removal. It was postponement, and postponed feelings don't disappear. They accumulate quietly, waiting for a moment when your guard is lower, which is usually why the smallest inconvenience can trigger a reaction that seems wildly disproportionate to whoever's standing nearby. This is one of the more uncomfortable truths in Jung's work, and it applies just as much to you as to anyone you've ever resented. The intensity of your reaction to someone else's behavior is rarely about the behavior itself. It's about how closely that behavior brushes against something you've refused to look at in yourself. The controlling person makes you furious because some part of you understands the fear underneath control. The dishonest person makes you furious because some part of you knows exactly how tempting a convenient lie can feel. This doesn't make you the same as them. It makes you human, which is precisely the uncomfortable equality Jung wanted people to sit with. Once you accept this, the entire framework of judging other people starts to soften without becoming naive. You stop needing villains because villains are simple, and simple stories are comforting, but they're rarely accurate. Instead, you start seeing wounded people defending unexamined identities, some of them kind, some of them cruel, most of them somewhere in between, shifting depending on fear, ego, and whatever unresolved history happens to be triggered in that particular moment. This shift changes the way you experience conflict entirely. You stop needing to win arguments to prove you were right, because you start noticing that most arguments were never really about the topic being discussed. They were about identity, about someone protecting a self-image that felt threatened, about someone defending a persona instead of examining a shadow. Understanding this doesn't mean you tolerate everything. It means you choose your battles based on what's actually at stake, instead of getting pulled into every performance someone else needs you to participate in. It also changes what you look for in the people you choose to keep close. You stop being impressed by confidence alone, because confidence, Jung would remind you, is often just a well-rehearsed mask, and masks don't tell you anything about what's underneath them. Instead, you start paying attention to how someone behaves when their mask slips, when they're tired, inconvenienced, embarrassed, or caught in a contradiction. Do they get curious about the gap, or do they get defensive and blame you for noticing it? That single response tells you more about a person's capacity for honesty than 100 confident first impressions ever could. This is also where you begin to understand something Jung considered essential, and something most self-help culture quietly avoids. Healing isn't the absence of a shadow, it's a working relationship with one. The goal was never to become someone without jealousy, without anger, without the capacity for control or deceit. The goal was to know those parts of yourself well enough that they stop running the show without your permission. A person who has met their own capacity for cruelty isn't more likely to be cruel. They're less likely to be blindsided by it, less likely to disguise it as something noble, less likely to inflict it on someone else while insisting they'd never do such a thing. This is why the most trustworthy people you'll ever meet are rarely the ones who insist they're incapable of doing something wrong. They're the ones who can say, quietly and without defensiveness, that they know exactly what they're capable of under the right conditions, and choose, again and again, not to become that. That kind of honesty requires having already met the shadow instead of denying its existence, and it's rare enough that you'll recognize it the moment you encounter it, because it doesn't need an audience to hold itself accountable. Once you notice this quality in someone, everything else about how you relate to people begins recalibrating. You stop mistaking reassurance for trustworthiness. Anyone can promise loyalty. Fewer people can demonstrate it consistently when there's nothing to gain from the performance. You stop mistaking intensity for depth. Some of the most unstable relationships feel the most significant, simply because chaos demands more attention than calm ever will. And you stop mistaking someone's confidence in their own goodness as proof of it, because the loudest declarations of virtue often come from the people least willing to examine themselves honestly. This recalibration is uncomfortable at first, because it removes a lot of shortcuts you didn't realize you were relying on. It's easier to trust someone because they said the right words than to watch their behavior across months before drawing a conclusion. It's easier to assume warmth means safety than to notice that warmth, without consistency, is just another kind of performance. But shortcuts are exactly what got most people into the relationships that eventually hurt them, because shortcuts are built on projection, and projection, as Jung understood better than almost anyone, is simply hope wearing the disguise of perception. Once this becomes clear, you start extending the same scrutiny to your own behavior, not out of guilt, but out of consistency. If you've spent this much energy noticing where other people's masks don't match their actions, it becomes impossible to ignore the moments where your own mask does the same thing. The times you've said yes while meaning no. The times you've smiled through resentment because honesty felt too expensive in that particular moment. The times you've performed strength you didn't feel simply because vulnerability seemed like it might cost you something you weren't ready to lose. This isn't meant to make you feel like a hypocrite. It's meant to make you feel like a person. Because every human being does this to some degree. And the difference between someone who's doing quiet, honest work on themselves and someone who isn't has nothing to do with whether they perform a persona. Everyone does. It has everything to do with whether they know they're doing it, and whether they're willing to notice when the performance has started costing them more than it's protecting them from. This is the quiet, unglamorous center of what Jung called individuation, and it rarely looks the way people expect. It doesn't look like a dramatic before and after. It looks like small, private moments of honesty that no one else will ever witness. Choosing to say the uncomfortable true thing instead of the comfortable expected one. Noticing the flicker of jealousy and asking what it's protecting instead of immediately hiding it. Catching yourself mid-excuse for someone's behavior and asking honestly whether you're protecting them or protecting yourself from the discomfort of finally seeing them clearly. And slowly, without announcing it to anyone, this changes the texture of every relationship you're in. You stop needing people to be perfect because you've already met your own imperfection and are still standing. You stop needing certainty about someone's intentions because you've learned to watch behavior over time instead of demanding guarantees up front. And you stop mistaking the absence of conflict for the presence of peace because you understand now that some of the calmest relationships are calm only because no one involved has been honest enough yet to disturb them. Jung believed the reward for this kind of honesty was never comfort. It was clarity, which is a colder, more useful gift. Clarity doesn't promise you'll never be hurt again. It promises you'll recognize the pattern faster the next time it starts forming, that you'll notice the mask slipping earlier, that you'll trust the quiet, private record your own mind keeps instead of talking yourself out of it for months or years at a time. Clarity doesn't make you invulnerable. It makes you accountable to what you've already seen, instead of pretending you haven't seen it. You start noticing why certain conversations feel hollow the moment you stop performing in them, why certain smiles feel rehearsed the second you stop needing them to be real, why some people only ever love the parts of you that were convenient for them, and why almost everyone, if you watch closely enough, is quietly fighting a private war between the mask they show and the person underneath it. A war most people never admit to out loud, including, if you're honest, yourself. But maybe the real realization isn't that people wear masks. It's that the mask was never the problem to begin with. The problem was believing it was permanent, believing the projection you built was the whole truth of a person instead of just the beginning of one. And maybe growing up, really growing up, starts the exact moment you stop searching for perfect people to complete a fantasy in your head and start seeing people exactly as they are. Inconsistent, defensive, capable of love and capable of harm, sometimes within the very same conversation. Because the day you stop romanticizing people is also the day you stop needing them to finish a story your own mind started writing without their permission. You stop begging reality to be softer than it actually is. And strangely, that's the moment your vision finally becomes clear. Not bitter, not hopeless, just clear. And clarity changes the way you move through every relationship that comes after it. Slower to trust, but far more honest once you do. Harder to fool, but easier to actually know. Because the danger was never only that other people could wear a mask. It was that your own hope, your own loneliness, your own desire to be understood, could quietly build one for them before they ever said a single word. And once you finally understand that, the way people behave stops feeling shocking. It simply starts feeling human. If this made you think of someone in your own life, or maybe made you think of yourself, leave a comment with the word aware. This happens to almost everyone, and almost no one notices it happening. You meet someone kind once, and your mind quietly writes an entire character study based on that single moment. You meet someone confident, and your mind assumes depth, loyalty, safety, none of which were ever proven. You meet someone who says the right thing at the right time, and suddenly you're not building a relationship with a person anymore. You're building one with a projection, a version of them assembled entirely inside your own head. Jung believed this is one of the most dangerous habits of the human mind, not because people are evil, but because the mind hates uncertainty so much that it would rather invent a finished picture of someone than sit with the discomfort of not knowing them yet. So it fills in the blanks. It assumes warmth where there's only charm. It assumes depth where there's only performance. And it does this so quietly that most people don't realize they fell in love with a guess. Reality doesn't argue with this fantasy right away. It waits. It arrives slowly, in small inconsistencies you talk yourself out of noticing. A joke that lands slightly too sharp to be innocent. A promise that quietly stops being kept. A warmth that only shows up when you're useful and disappears the moment you're not. None of these moments feel big enough to react to on their own. That's exactly why they work. The mask doesn't fall apart all at once. It slips one thread at a time, and by the time you notice the pattern, you've usually excused it a dozen times already. You've probably lived through this without having language for it. That specific ache of realizing the version of someone in your memory is warmer than the version standing in front of you now. It's not that they tricked you exactly. It's that you were never given the full picture, and your mind, uncomfortable with an incomplete story, quietly finished writing it for them. Once you notice this in one relationship, you start noticing it everywhere. The coworker who's supportive to your face and undermines you the moment you're not in the room. The family member who preaches honesty but disappears the second honesty is aimed at them. The friend who calls themselves loyal, yet was suspiciously absent during the one moment loyalty actually mattered. Jung would say, you're not becoming paranoid, you're finally comparing the mask to the behavior underneath it, and the two rarely match as well as people hope. This is where the shadow enters the picture. The part of Jung's work most people quote, but few actually sit with. The shadow is everything a person refuses to acknowledge about themselves. The jealousy they call concern, the control they call protection, the cruelty they call honesty. And here's the part that matters most. Most people aren't lying when they defend themselves this way. They actually believe it. The mask isn't a performance to them. It's their entire self-image. And the moment you point at the gap between what they claim and what they do, they don't experience it as truth. They experience it as an attack. This is why confronting someone's inconsistency rarely goes the way people expect. You'd think showing someone the evidence of their own behavior would create clarity. Instead, it usually creates defensiveness, because you're not just contradicting an action, you're threatening an identity they've spent years protecting. And people will defend a false identity far more fiercely than they'll defend the truth, because the false identity is the only thing standing between them and their own shadow. Once you understand this, entire relationships start making a different kind of sense. The parent who insists they've always supported you, while every memory says otherwise. The partner who calls themselves easygoing, right before an explosive reaction to something small. The friend who claims to want your honesty, then punishes you quietly for weeks after you gave it. None of them are consciously performing. They're protecting a version of themselves they need to believe in, because the alternative is looking directly at the shadow underneath it, and almost no one is willing to do that voluntarily. This is also why some relationships only function through denial. And denial, once you notice it, is harder to unsee than almost anything else. Denial is what lets a person keep loving someone who has shown them who they are a dozen times already. Denial says, maybe this time is different. Denial says, they were just stressed. Denial says, everyone has bad days. And denial keeps working right up until awareness catches up to it. And awareness, once it arrives, doesn't ask permission before changing everything. Most relationships don't actually end when respect disappears. They end months, sometimes years later, when awareness finally catches up to what respect's absence already revealed. And in between those two moments sits an entire private war most people never talk about. The war between what you're feeling and what you're willing to admit you're feeling. You'll find yourself defending someone in conversations with friends, while quietly documenting evidence against them in your own mind. You'll find yourself making excuses out loud, while a much quieter voice keeps a private, honest record you haven't looked at directly yet. That private record is the beginning of clarity. And clarity, once it starts forming, spreads to everything. You start noticing how some people only get warm the moment you begin pulling away, how respect suddenly reappears once you stop chasing it, how attention increases the second it's no longer guaranteed. This isn't coincidence, it's a pattern, and Jung believed patterns reveal far more about a person than their words ever will. Because words can be rehearsed, but repeated behavior can't lie forever. This is uncomfortable to admit, but human behavior is mostly reactive, not principled. Most people don't value what's freely given. They value what feels difficult to keep, which is why kindness without boundaries so often gets quietly mistaken for weakness and eventually gets treated accordingly. Kindness that never says no teaches people exactly how far they're allowed to go, and most people, without ever meaning to, will go exactly that far. You can trace this conditioning back further than most people are comfortable admitting. In school, it was the quiet kid who absorbed disrespect without pushing back, slowly becoming the person everyone felt safe testing. It was the confident kid who got admired despite treating people poorly, because confidence gets rewarded long before character does. It was the one who gave the most and slowly became the one people noticed the least, because human beings, without realizing it, tend to organize themselves around power long before they organize themselves around fairness. Jung believed the parts people reject in themselves don't disappear. They get projected outward, onto other people, disguised as judgment. The insecure accuse others of seeking attention. The dishonest become obsessed with other people's loyalty. The controlling insist they're only protecting you. And the people most afraid of being abandoned are often, without realizing it, the ones who end up suffocating everyone who tries to stay close. Once you start seeing this clearly, you stop reacting to single moments and start watching patterns over time. And patterns, unlike moments, are almost impossible to fake for long. The friend who only appears during your crisis, never during your calm. The person who quietly competes with you in every conversation, disguised as playful teasing. The relationship where every vulnerable thing you've shared eventually gets used against you later, dressed up as concern. At first, your mind will fight this realization, because your mind doesn't want to lose the people it's already invested in. So you'll rationalize. They're just going through something. That's just how they've always been. It's not that deep. But eventually, a harder question surfaces, one that's difficult to unhear once it's been asked. What if you've spent years translating disrespect into misunderstanding, simply because the alternative meant losing someone? That single question changes almost everything, because it reveals a truth most people avoid their entire lives. Many relationships don't survive on love. They survive on denial, and denial can hold a family together for decades. Denial can keep a toxic friendship alive for years past its expiration. Denial can keep someone attached to a person who stopped valuing them long before they were willing to admit it. Most relationships don't actually end when someone stops caring. They end when you finally allow yourself to notice they stopped caring. And that noticing creates a kind of distance that isn't always physical, but is unmistakably real. Conversations that used to matter start feeling hollow. Compliments start sounding transactional. Affection starts feeling less like sincerity and more like strategy. Because you've stopped being hypnotized by the performance, and once the performance stops working on you, you start seeing the machinery behind it. This is when social dynamics become harder to ignore, because the same pattern repeats at a larger scale. Groups quietly punish authenticity in people who refuse to keep performing. Certain honesty makes rooms uncomfortable not because it's cruel, but because it threatens an unspoken agreement everyone else is still protecting. An agreement to avoid saying what everyone already privately knows. The person who breaks that silence first is rarely thanked for it. Usually they become the problem, simply for refusing to keep pretending. This is the strange cost of seeing clearly. You become harder to fool, but also harder to belong around, because so much of social comfort depends on everyone maintaining their assigned mask. Watch closely, and you'll notice how people shift depending on power. The insecure become unnaturally agreeable around authority. The confident suddenly grow dismissive around anyone perceived as weaker. Morality itself seems to bend depending on who's watching. And the most unsettling part is how few people are consciously aware they're doing it. Jung believed the ego will defend its self-image at nearly any cost, because most people desperately need to believe they're good. So instead of confronting their own darkness, they simply rename it. Cruelty becomes honesty. Manipulation becomes love. Control becomes protection. Jealousy becomes concern. The mind is remarkably skilled at disguising its true motives, especially from the person carrying them. This is why the most dangerous people you'll ever meet aren't usually the openly cruel ones. They're the ones who are completely convinced of their own innocence. The friend who tears you down while insisting it's for your own good. The partner who makes you feel guilty for needing space. The person who creates chaos and then plays the victim the moment you finally react to it. Because victimhood, used this way, can quietly become its own form of power. Once you notice this pattern, your entire way of listening to people changes. You stop focusing only on what someone says and start asking a quieter, more useful question. What emotional outcome does this person actually want from me? That single question tends to reveal almost everything a person's words were designed to hide. And this is exactly where the illusion of romance often collapses too. Because so many relationships aren't built on love at all. They're built on unspoken psychological arrangements neither person ever said out loud. I'll make you feel important if you make me feel needed. I'll stay if you never make me face being alone. I'll admire you if you protect me from my own emptiness. This is why people change so suddenly the moment the arrangement stops benefiting them. Not because they became someone new overnight, but because the mask was only ever attached to a condition, and conditions eventually reveal themselves. You can watch this most clearly after success, failure, or change of any kind. Become successful, and hidden envy quietly surfaces in people who once called themselves supportive. Become vulnerable, and hidden disrespect finally shows its face. Set a boundary, and hidden entitlement reveals exactly how conditional someone's affection really was. Nothing exposes the truth of a relationship faster than changing the role someone quietly assigned you inside it. And here is the quiet, uncomfortable center of everything Jung was trying to say. People don't always love who you actually are. Sometimes they love who you used to be, back when you were easier to predict, easier to manage, easier to keep small enough that they never had to face their own reflection standing next to you. That realization doesn't have to make you cynical about people. It simply removes the fantasy, and once the fantasy is gone, you're finally able to see the difference between being surrounded and being understood, which turn out to be two very different things. Because you can have a full calendar, a crowded group chat, a partner beside you every night, and still feel completely unseen underneath all of it. If every version of you they know was carefully built to keep them comfortable, that exhaustion after socializing, the strange hollowness of being present physically while absent everywhere that matters, is what happens when you spend years performing a self instead of living as one. There's a particular kind of loneliness that only shows up once you've started seeing clearly. And it's different from ordinary loneliness, because it isn't caused by absence. It's caused by presence without recognition. You can be in a room full of people who genuinely like the version of you they've met and still feel like a stranger standing among them, because the version they like was built carefully, over years, to avoid the exact moments that might make them uncomfortable. Nobody forced you to build that version. You built it the same way everyone does, quietly, gradually, out of the reasonable fear that the real one might not be welcome. This is where Jung's idea of the persona becomes impossible to ignore. The persona isn't a lie exactly. It's closer to a costume worn so long that the seams have started to feel like skin. Most people don't remember choosing it. They simply noticed, somewhere in childhood, which version of them got approval and which version got silence. And the nervous system, being far more practical than proud, chose approval every time. It wasn't weakness, it was survival. And survival strategies, once they work, are almost never questioned again. Not until they start quietly costing you the exact thing they were meant to protect. Because the strange irony Jung kept returning to is that the persona built to earn love is often the very thing that prevents you from ever feeling loved. If people only know the curated version of you, then even their warmest affection is aimed at someone who doesn't fully exist. And some deep, unspoken part of you knows this, which is why praise can feel hollow, why compliments can feel like they're landing on the wrong person, why being told you're wonderful by someone who has never seen you struggle, contradict yourself, or fall apart can feel strangely lonely instead of comforting. This is also why the people who eventually see your unfiltered self, the version that isn't managed for anyone's comfort, often become either the most important relationships of your life or the ones that quietly end. Because showing someone your shadow is a kind of test neither of you signed up for consciously. Either they stay and something real finally begins, or they leave and you learn, painfully, that some affection was only ever extended to the performance.